Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can I have your attention just for a moment, just for some general safety information announcements. If you can take note of the emergency exits on the doors at the back of the room and here at the side. And if you need any assistance during the meeting, there are members of Policing Authority staff available. Again, the meeting is streamed live, so can everyone just check their mobile phones are switched off? And again, just be aware that anybody who's present in the room may appear, I suppose, as part of the record. And just for those not participating in the meeting, it is an engagement between the authority and the Garda Commissioner and his colleagues. So anyone else present is here to observe. So just please keep silent during the meeting if you're not participating. And again, just lastly, if you do need to leave the room during the meeting, if you can just do it quietly at the back of the hall without disturbing the meeting. Thank you very much and welcome, and I'll pass you over to our chairperson, Bob Collins.
Deborah Mass agus fáilte of Goodíon Criniú Pibli Shud and Udros Pauline nach den Heron Trish Sus and Taurig. You're very welcome to this public meeting of the Policing Authority of Ireland. In the first instance, can I welcome Assistant Commissioner Angela Willis to her first public meeting of the Authority, and to Assistant Commissioner John Roberts, not to his first meeting of the Authority, but to the first public meeting of the Authority. So you're both very welcome, and we wish you great success in your careers, having been recently appointed. Commissioner, as the first item, we just wanted to touch on one or two issues, and if there was a sequence of events that encapsulate the challenges that face Garda members and the risks that face Garda members in the nature of their duty. It has been the sequence of some truly awful events over the last number of weeks, whether in Tala or Multifarnham or Clarecastle. And I just wonder whether you would say something to us about the impact of that nature of policing work on individuals and how the organisation can support them. And we'll touch later on in a moment on another issue where members have been assaulted.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. I think just very regrettably, over the last 4 weeks, we've seen a series of very difficult incidents that members of Garda Síochána have been called to, and indeed they've dealt with in a very professional and indeed proficient manner. But I would say that all of these incidents, they leave a lasting impression with the individual members of Garda Síochána and staff who've had to respond to the scenes and then deal with the aftermath of those scenes. There can be no doubt about that. And that's against the backdrop, very regrettably, of very difficult incidents that Garda Síochána constantly is dealing with, be it road traffic, serious road traffic collisions, other fatalities, and indeed homicides. And so there is a constant backdrop of dealing with difficult incidents, and on top of that then there are verbal and indeed physical attacks on members of Garda Síochána. Superintendents Association yesterday raised the real problem around attacks on members of Garda Síochána over social media. We ourselves are very conscious of all of this. We're very conscious of the support that we provide to members. But I would say to the wider community, members of Garda Síochána are here to protect you. All of us accept the burden of that duty, and we accept it willingly as volunteers and to Garda Síochána, and proud to be members of Garda Síochána at that. But we also deserve the community support in terms of dealing with some of the very difficult incidents that inevitably are part and parcel of our policing work. We have systems to support individuals. A lot of it does come down to local supervisors, the local teams, and making sure that there's ongoing support there. But we also provide professional support through our Chief Medical Officer, access to specific welfare services and our Employee Assistance Service. But at the same time, Policing is at times a very difficult profession, a very rewarding profession, which hopefully can carry you through the difficult times. But I recognise, as all of my senior leadership team recognise, just the heavy weight of responsibility borne by some of our most junior members in terms of the incidents that they have to respond to. And just, I think the last 4 weeks have been illustrative of just how difficult those can be. Thank you.
Is there anything you might want to say to the public that would give them some sense of the supports that are available to Garda members who encounter these circumstances?
Well, firstly, there's the local management support. All of us are there to look out for each other. And then beyond that, then we have the professional support with the Chief Medical Officer and his staff who provide, in effect, occupational health services to Garda Síochána, including psychological and support for those who are suffering from mental health issues. Beyond that, then we have our own employee assistance service, which is a service spread right across the whole of Garda Síochána, and they day to day are committed then to supporting individuals who are going through difficult periods in terms of their personal circumstances or family circumstances, or just in terms of their service within Garda Síochána. And we have beyond that then a 24/7 helpline that's available to all members and staff within Garda Síochána. And we're always then looking to see what else that might be done. We certainly have learned from the cultural audit, the internal cultural audit that we've just recently conducted, and that has raised some red flags around, I think, the mental well-being and health of Garda Síochána and the members within it. And those are things then now that have been highlighted to us that we then have to find an action plan to help ameliorate and deal with.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. It goes without saying, but it is important to say it, as we have many times before, that the authority condemns without hesitation and without qualification any attacks, assaults on Garda members in the course of their duties. And while there has been a very considerable media focus on events that took place in Cherrywood, it's not by any means confined to that night or that locality. And regrettably, all too often, as you've said, Garda members face assault and abuse and a great deal worse in the course of their duty. And it must be, and it is, condemned. Moving on to the first of the substantive issues that we have on this afternoon's agenda, which is the examination of the Garda Síochána review and the work of the independent examiner appointed by the policing authority, Mr. Derek Penman, on the cancellation of CAD 999 incidents. I think that it's not necessary to have an extended or even an unextended history lesson or background in respect of it. But it is important to note that it's almost exactly 2 years since this issue first came to the attention of the Garda Síochána, and some months later to the authority, and some considerable time after that when the full extent of it was disclosed to the authority back in April, May of last year. And this final report from Derek Penman, which has to be read in conjunction with the interim report produced in August, I think, November of last November, represent a very significant contribution to our understanding of what happened, embody a set of findings in respect of what happened, and a set of recommendations as to future action. Like the report, our own view of this, we now want to be forward-facing, but without in any sense ignoring, because we can't, what has happened, and without continuing to be engaged with it, as we will be. It has been, I think, a very significant and important episode in the life of the organisation, and it has identified the significance of the service that the Garda Síochána provides to the public, and the significance of ensuring that the quality of that service is as the public would want it to be, and that the performance of those people who are engaged in providing service to people at their most vulnerable is as it should be. And there is considerable work still to be done, and it is a never-ending task. It's not concluded by the finalisation of Mr. Penman's work or by the publication, as we did today, of the report. It is a work of continuing unceasing significance and importance for the public and for the Garda Síochána. And Shalom Binchy is going to lead the questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I know at the beginning when this issue came to light, you said that the standard that the public should expect when they make calls to 999 fell below what they should be provided with. And I think you have from the beginning shown a will to improve that system and improve standards. And I hope that that will continue now that we have a report with very clear recommendations. So I suppose I'm just going to start by asking you, do you accept the findings that Mr. Penman made, and do you accept his recommendations in full?
If I could just make a few comments, I think in response. We also welcome Mr. Penman's report and recommendations. It obviously informs our own assessment as well that there were missed opportunities to engage with callers, even if there wasn't a crime, but certainly we've identified as well cases of regard of poor behaviour by Garda personnel. The final phase of the review, which is ongoing, is in respect of the discipline process, and that's important that that's followed through on. But we would also say we took immediate mitigating actions when the risk was identified in October 2020. We continue, as you say, to improve and make improvements to the CAD process with additional staff, a national approach to incident response, with a new purpose-built DMR control room, and especially we look forward to the deployment of the new CAD system early in 2023, and that allows then to make further improvements around more precisely recording addresses using error codes, but also then I think a behavioural shift from a dispatch focused system to consideration and implementation of a complete customer and victim centred relationship management system. So considering right from the start that in effect when the first call is made, we are opening up a relationship with this individual, particularly those who are most vulnerable and who might be deterred by the initial response. So we, of course, then, as we are going forward, will factor in the recommendations then that Mr. Penman has made. And the new CAD system will be based on the most modern technology, and obviously then our processes are going to be informed by the recommendations that Mr. Penman has made.
Very good. And you said that you put immediate mitigation measures in place, but the report is clear that those mitigation measures were not sufficient to prevent ongoing inappropriate closure of calls. So even after the interim report, there were still inappropriate cancellation of calls and inappropriate closure under the wrong headings, which prevented appropriate follow-up by Garda Síochána. So in terms of the supervision that's been provided now and into the future, what sort of reassurance can we have that that supervision is going to prevent inappropriate closures into the future?
Well, this has already been described. this whole situation and the evolution of it has placed a real emphasis on the receipt of calls by Garda Síochána. We now have national processes where 3-4 years ago we didn't. We have 4 control rooms where we can standardise procedures. The move to DMR and then the move to the new CAD2 process will facilitate that. We've put in place training and we've put in place dip sampling. In the end, I can't give a complete assurance about the behaviour of those who would take the calls. Even with all of that, we have also had to deal with individuals in the very recent past whose performance has not been up to scratch and provided poor performance. So we are dealing with very much, I would say, a human endeavour. The individuals within the control rooms do work hard, do work in very stressful circumstances at times, and they are very conscious of the next calls arriving in as well. So that's been set in that context too. So in part, the supervision is obviously around quality, but the supervision is also in terms of the support in what is at times very pressurised and very difficult circumstances as well. And you know, we spoke about some of the emergency situations that Garda members have had to respond to, but all of those commenced with a 999 call that call takers and dispatchers were dealing with, in effect, you know, eyewitness account of terrible events unfolding, and that has to be taken account as well. So there's just not an element of here's the standard and being ruthless around that. There is, and we have a responsibility around the welfare of those who are taking calls often in very difficult circumstances. So it is finding that balance. It's about the explanation of the importance of this work and making sure people then are appropriately selected and skilled and assessed in the work they do, but also then supported going forward, because we do recognise the value and the absolute importance of the correct handling of calls right from the start.
Yes, and this report focuses on that call handling and shows up very serious deficits in the standard of call handling, while on the one hand some calls are answered very professionally and accurately and the person is passed on to the service that they need. On the other hand, there are calls where the call taker is abrupt, rude, doesn't take the necessary details to follow up, or incorrectly details some of the crucial information such as addresses, and that's shown up by the report. Or, you know, the report also shows that, you know, in certain examples, for example, call taker didn't ask for contact details for a person who was a witness to a very serious sexual assault, and that led to the potential for serious harm, because that victim may never have come forward again. So the report does highlight those failures in call taking. But to go back to the issue of supervision, you're saying that there are supervisory matters in place now and that you're looking at recruitment and those sort of issues. How are you doing that? Like, how often are people being talked to one-to-one to see if they have issues arising from their call taking, whether they're stressed, whether they're traumatized by what they're hearing? What one-to-one performance management is taking place now?
Thanks, Shalom. So one of the things I suppose that we've took immediate corrective action to address was the absence of supervision or insufficient supervision. So we have substantially increased the supervisors. We're still not where we would like to be in terms of having 2 per unit, but they're substantially increased. So what that allows happen is literally active supervision on the floor, being tuned in to what's going on, apart from the dip sampling that the Commissioner referred to, or other quality assurance processes, just being available to the call takers and call dispatchers in the live environment and being there to support them. In terms of what engagements have taken place, all the call takers and all the dispatchers have been met by either the superintendent in the DMR or the inspector in the control rooms around the country. You know, following from this review, lessons learned, issues arising, and so forth. In terms of the supervisors, then there's a 2-day training program that goes through all the, in addition to the policy and procedure, etc., the issues around governance, what the supervisory role entails, what we expect of them in terms of making sure that the service that we provide in each of our 4 control rooms is of a standard that the public expect and indeed deserve. So that's an ongoing process. Separate to that, then, we have a process in place whereby we are increasing the number of call takers and dispatchers. That's at various stages of the approval process. Some of those positions are backfills, some are new positions in getting ready for the new CAD 2, which will come, which will be rolled out in Q1 2023. So I suppose it's ongoing, and as we've said at previous meetings, this review has shone a light into the control rooms, a light that wasn't, I suppose, shone before, both in terms of the complexity of the working environment, but also the importance of recruitment, selection and training and constant monitoring of the role, function and just day-to-day operations of the control room function.
When do you think you will have the required number of supervisors?
So we have I suppose I can't give you a definitive answer in relation to that, but we have a panel of sergeants that we're drawing from. There are competing demands across the organisation. There is I suppose, a lag in terms of a promotion competition for a number of years. So which resulted in a whole range of areas and functions across the organisation, but as soon as possible. I suppose we are committed to this, and we do understand and appreciate the importance of having that supervisory element in the control rooms. I have the numbers here if you're interested in hearing them.
I don't think we need the numbers for today's purpose, but what I would like is an assurance that this is a priority and is being given urgent attention, and that the numbers will be at the required level in the very near future.
Well, yes, it is a priority and it is receiving attention, and it is our aim and desire that those numbers would be at the required level. And
is there continued monitoring and assessment to see that calls are not being cancelled inappropriately?
Yes, and the Commissioner already alluded to it. Since all these mitigations were in place, we 2 incidents have come to light whereby that ongoing supervision and intrusion surfaced those, and we have previously reported those to the authority.
And you mentioned recruitment there, that you're recruiting new call takers. Has your recruitment process changed in any way to make sure that you're getting the right people for this very difficult job?
So our recruitment is through the Public Appointments Service. I suppose we've taken extra care in terms of the job description, and obviously once they're selected, then the training, the ongoing training. Part of the training is scenario-based training. That's in addition to all our own internal policies, procedures in terms of domestic violence, code of ethics, missing persons policies, all the key, I suppose, vulnerability policies that have a certain vulnerability attached to them. So it's really about the ongoing training, initial training, but also in-service training that we will put in place for them, and then the supervision coupled with that.
And Mr. Penman has identified that training is not the issue, but there are issues with lack of empathy, for example, from the call takers. Do you agree that came across in the examples given and from the calls that you listened to yourself?
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose, as the Commissioner has already mentioned, the operating environment is a very pressurised one. Notwithstanding that, the people that are calling in on the 999 system are calling from a point of crisis in some shape or form, and certainly through the review, while there were examples of very good practice, there were also examples where we didn't display that empathy and that, I suppose, curiosity that one would expect when somebody is calling in from a vulnerable position or a position of crisis.
And I think Mr. Penman gave an example of a woman who called in relation to an assault by her partner, and this was not recorded under the DVSA, the domestic violence category, which would mean there'd be a follow-up. But the call taker appeared not to listen to this woman, came across as rude, impatient, lacked empathy, and the caller was repeatedly asked to repeat herself, even though she was very clear. So do you agree that in the recruitment process, it's very important to get the right people and to assess that they will be able to be empathetic and listen properly and take details properly? Do you see a key role at that early stage?
Well, yes, as part of the selection process, and indeed the interview process in particular, these are the skills with which we require. They're the skills that we require of the call takers and the call dispatchers. So the interview stage is critically important to get those.
Are you having an input now to change that part of the recruitment process? You've said you've changed the booklet, but have you changed anything in the interview process?
Well, the interview process, so the Garda Síochána will be represented on the interview board, so that would feed in at that point. I can't tell you who exactly will be on the interview board, but it'll be a senior member of Garda Síochána who is well aware of the requirement for appropriate skills in terms of empathy, listening, showing that compassionate tone throughout.
Do you see anything when you're conducting your performance management assessments? Do you see any problems arising, for example, from, are there times in a shift where a person might be showing less empathy, maybe at the end of a long shift, or, or before people take holidays or things like that? Are there patterns that you've identified or that you've asked individual members? Do they find themselves that there are times when they're maybe after a very traumatic call, do they find that they're less compassionate on a next call? Or have you assessed those type of things or talked one-to-one with your staff about those issues to try and figure out, is there sometimes some burnout or compassion fatigue or any issues like that, or just exhaustion maybe?
Well, I suppose any role in Garda Síochána, has the potential for all of those things you enumerated there, burnout and fatigue, etc. And I suppose the control room is no different in that regard. It's I suppose the volume of calls that can be backed up at any one point in time at different points in the day or into the evening, can be quite overwhelming. And I suppose that's where the active supervision on the call, on the floor, comes in, so that the supervisor can be on top of whatever might be going on for individuals and maybe give somebody relief if that's what's required, and make sure that they get appropriate breaks and all that. So the welfare of the control room staff is of key importance. Certainly, that is something that we're very conscious of, given the pressurised environment that it is that they're operating in.
There seems to be a lot of emphasis then on the supervisor doing all of these things and not, maybe performance management input that maybe needs to be there, because, and which is a bit of a worry, because in the report, Mr. Penman does say that there's limited evidence of supervisory checks, and that continues to be a problem. So it's quite worrying that there's such a reliance on supervisory role when that seems to be still lacking. I mean, do you agree that the report shows that there's a need for really serious improvement on the supervisory roles?
Yes, absolutely, and the need for intrusive supervision, and that's why we've gone to such extents to try and increase the numbers, and and we are committed to doing that. So I suppose one of the gaps was the low level of supervision, and then if we take into account that people take leave, and there are various things that might take them away from their day job, so that's why we need to have adequate supervision, so that there are supervisors there at all times. That's the vision, and we certainly are intent on achieving that.
How often are the Gardaí dip sampling and listening to calls now?
I might just turn to Andrew for that one in terms of the frequency.
I'm not sure of the exact numbers. I believe it's super shift.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, in the report, it's recommended that the policing authority would have a role, or there would be a form of external oversight and an ability to listen to calls, so that there would be an external audit of the calls. Do you are you in agreement that that would be a good way to monitor and audit these calls to make sure that the standard is kept at or gets to a high standard and then is kept at a high standard?
I was presuming that be in the form of the inspectorate role in terms of just of policing, of delivery of a policing function, and a very important policing function, but one which is set in a whole continuum of our policing responsibilities. So I think that's one that we will obviously work through. We're very conscious of the public confidence that's wrapped up in terms of efficient, effective response to the 999 system. And as we've set out already, we've put in place a number of improvements and system changes, and also then the modernisation of the system itself will change the behaviours and culture around that. But I would say want to set that in the context of just all that we're engaged in, and beyond that as well. And I'd have thought that was then in the position for an inspector then in terms of the new arrangements of the bill in terms of taking that forward.
Well, when the new arrangements come into place, obviously the new body should have that power. But the report is clear that the calls should be monitored and assessed by internally and externally, and suggest that it would be the policing authority that should do that, and that might require legislative underpinning. And it's I would say that's a really crucial recommendation in the report to ensure the quality of call taking, call handling, and how calls are cancelled. So, I mean, at the beginning of my questioning, you said that you did accept the recommendations in full. Is there some equivocation about how far you go in accepting that particular recommendation?
Well, I don't think it's equivocation on my part, but I just need to understand what that would mean. I think it's for us to supervise actually the provision of our services, and I have responsibility, as of all supervisors then, beyond me then, in terms of the services that we provide.
So
supervision is different from oversight.
Are you saying you're not open to external oversight on that?
No, I think I would like further time to consider this, just in terms of how this might be worked through.
Do you see the importance of external oversight?
Well, yes, obviously, but that's different from, in effect, the supervision of our day-to-day delivery of policing function here in terms of these calls.
Very good. Do you accept that the calls to local stations, which are unrecorded, present a very serious vulnerability in terms of any oversight of the quality of that call taking and cancellation?
Well, the strength of the 999 system is obviously every call is recorded and then can be retrieved and checked back on. What we had sought to do with the new command and control, and also then the command control centres, is that such emergency calls then would be directed automatically, or would be directed from stations to those where then the call would be recorded. It's a very considerable undertaking for us to record every call coming into the station, but we'll have to consider that and look at what the resourcing issues are in respect of that as well. It's a very considerable undertaking in terms of recording all calls that would come into Garda stations.
Yeah, I understand that, and it would require a lot of investment. But on the other hand, it's identified as a massive vulnerability, and we've seen in a situation where calls can be recorded in the 999 in the control rooms, that there was a problem, but we don't know what the problems are in the stations, but we can assume that they're the same or maybe even worse, because getting through to a station in the first place is more difficult, and getting an answer in the first place is more difficult. So, you know, you've had that recommendation since the interim report came out last November. Has there been any movement on trying to improve that situation and looking at what might be done to protect people from that vulnerability?
Andrew, do you have there, please?
Sure, I'll come in on that. I mean, as the Commissioner said, our approach is to centralise the emergency call taking function. So in the first instance, people should call 999 in an emergency. In the event that they call a station, the approach is to, as quickly as possible, route that to a control centre where we have all of the training and the supervision in place. I mean, as you said yourself, it's almost impossible to put that in place at a local level. The second issue is that with the rollout of the new CAD system, which is significantly more complex in terms of its data recording aspects, that it's just not going to be feasible to train every single member of Garda Síochána that might take a call at a station how to operate that system and then how to record the call. So we currently have a pilot underway in the northwestern region to see how effective it's going to be that we, when an emergency call comes through to a station, that can be immediately then routed to the appropriate control room. And this approach now will be a national control room, so it means if somebody rings to a Garda station, which is known to happen, but they're reporting something that isn't happening in that locality, it can be routed to the appropriate station. So for example, it has certainly happened that somebody calls concerned about a relative that lives on the other side of the country, and that means that because of this national system now, a unit can be dispatched from any of the control centres. Just the last point I want to make about the recording of calls is that we can't record all calls coming into stations until we know, or we need to have a mechanism so that we would know that call is an emergency call, and then we need to record it. We can't get into a situation where we're recording confidential calls or recording calls that come in from a solicitor or something like that. So our approach, very much what we're trialling, is that the calls will be routed as quickly and efficiently as possible, using as much of an automated mechanism as we can develop. It will be routed to control centres where they'll be dealt with consistently and recorded on the new CAD system. So that's our approach currently.
Can I ask you, Commissioner, have there been any lessons that you've learned from your own internal review and from this report that you've applied to other areas of policing?
Sorry, you need to help me a little bit more there if you have a particular thought in mind.
That's fair enough. I'm asking you if there have been any lessons that you've learned from your own internal review of the 999 calls or from Mr. Penman's reports that you've been able to apply to other areas. And what I have in mind, I suppose, is something like the cancellation of pulse incidents. So after a call has left the control room and is put on pulse, have you applied any lessons from this review and this report that would be applicable to how those matters are, in particular how they're cancelled or closed?
Well, I think in engaging in this work, we ourselves really went to the cutting edge of where this was in terms of the vulnerability and in terms of, in effect, a forensic review of the 6,000 cases and then the identification of the 2,932 which were incorrectly cancelled. But I would beyond that, I would say actually there was a deeper piece of learning in terms of victim engagement, particularly victim engagement around domestic abuse, and the learning being that if you don't get the initial contact and that initial follow through, so even just the telephone contact and then the initial face-to-face contact, beyond that, if you don't provide a good service there, then it's very likely then that overall our service will not meet the needs of that particular individual who's come forward to report. That has been, I think, part of our experience from the individual and, as I've said, forensic examination of these 2,900 cases, that the importance of an ongoing relationship of connecting with people and in fact, checking in with them, and then not being surprised when further information then comes to light as actually a bit of trust in the relationship grows. So I think what we would see in this, and you know, what we identified and been assisted by Mr. Penman in identifying, is moving this from simply call handling to, as I've said, the identification properly of a system which looks after victims properly, right from their very, very first contact, which can be via 999 or indeed call to the station. And that's an important point of learning. Then beyond that, obviously then, the ingenuity of our staff in terms of using CAD1, and then the manner then in which we've supervised, when we now supervise that, and the controls that we've put in place through individual supervisors and what they do. That's been a very important part of this. But it do also the actual recognition of the demands placed on the staff there as well. I've been in the control rooms and seen the supervisors, the sergeants walking the floors, and you know, watching carefully what's happening with individuals.
Here. This
Sorry?
sounds like a very long no to the question I asked. I mean, I'm asking, have you applied this to the cancellation of pulse incidents in guard stations? So, you know, have you looked at how those calls, how they're invalidated? Because in your own report in August, it's clear from that report that only 56% of pulse incidents that are being invalidated are going through GISC, which is the recommended process, and that means that there are 44% that are still being cancelled by individual Garda members. And I'm wondering if you've taken any learnings from this review and report and applied it to that, which is a very obvious area to apply it to, or if you've applied it to any other areas of policing.
All right, thank you.
Question, GISC.
Yeah, so just if I can just address the cancelling of incidents on pulse. So when an incident is put on pulse, it remains on pulse. If some new information comes to light that causes the incident to be invalidated, it's simply marked as such, but it's never removed from pulse. So in terms of GISC, they record calls. So members on the ground phone GISC, and they put the calls on the system. So currently, because of staffing deficits, the number of incidents that are recorded by GISC is not what it should be. It's at 65%. It really should be 95 plus. We're working on that. It's slower than we would want. It's slower than we're happy with. But there is a very robust process of validation in GISC once the calls go on. And you're quite right in saying that the accuracy of the calls that are put on by the Garda members is not what it should be. And that is why we want to get our staffing levels at GISC to such an extent that they would be recording the calls for at least 95%. Andrew, I don't know, do you want to add anything there?
Sure, just to explain the way the process in GISC works. So obviously our preference is that all crime incidents particularly are recorded by GISC, because they have the training on the crime counting rules and how to accurately record the calls. But a significant number, as the Deputy said, due to staffing issues in GISC, are recorded by Garda members themselves, so directly entered onto Pulse by the Garda members. So it's currently about 35% of all crime incidents are recorded by Garda members. But that's just the first stage in the process. The second stage in the process is that regardless of who creates the incident on Pulse, GISC also then has a second stage of more senior call takers, or reviewers as they're called. They review every single incident. So regardless of whether it's created by a GISC call taker or by the Garda member themselves, it's then reviewed again by GISC. So what the Deputy is referring to there is that we notice, and we have published these data quality statistics on our website, we publish them monthly, that the quality of those recorded by the member is lower, but that still does not mean that the low quality incident ends up in Pulse, because it's corrected by the reviewers and they put it on what's called review clarification. Well, the third stage, sorry, I just wanted to explain, the third stage in the process then is that every incident then is reviewed by the frontline Garda supervisor, the superintendent, that they review the incidents that are allocated to their district or to their unit, and then they again apply an additional quality check on that. If it doesn't seem right, they send it back again to that GISC data quality unit. So we believe we have a very robust process in place. The biggest issue we have with GISC capacity is that with low GIS capacity, Garda members are spending more time than they should then creating incidents, which is quite a time-consuming process, and GIS in turn then has to spend more time than validating them. But there's no impact on ultimately on data quality. It's inefficient, but there is no impact on data quality as a result of that.
But is there a risk that, similar to 999 closures, that cases are being invalidated when they shouldn't be? Because we know that Garda members, we know from the report that Garda members asked for calls to be cancelled and thereby avoided follow-up. We know that that happened, it's there in the report. How do we know that that's not happening in the stations as well through the inappropriate
You mean on Pulse or on CAD?
On Pulse.
Yeah, but again, it's that same process that GISC has data quality reports on all incidents that are it's much harder to close an incident on Pulse. It's a much more robust system than CAD. There's a record of every incident that's closed, and in fact, actually, there's automated checks in place, and there's data quality checks in place by GISC. If an incident is closed, then there has to be a solid reason behind that. So it's not like that there's the same level of if the status of an incident changes, then that goes back to the GISC data quality team that will review why it changed and why it was updated, particularly if it relates to closure. But there's no real concept of closing a Pulse incident. I mean, the incident is always there. You can't. It's the end. It's the end of the process. The data is always on Pulse. It will always be visible to GSAS and to other oversight in terms of it being recorded as a crime. You can't delete a Pulse incident, put it like that.
Are you saying you can delete a CAD incident?
You can. So the point about CAD is that CAD currently is a dispatch system, as the Commissioner mentioned earlier on. If you close the incident without the correct disposition or the correct closure method, it then goes no further. The purpose of CAD at the moment is to feed Pulse crime incidents. So if you inappropriately cancel or prematurely cancel on something on CAD, it's not deleted, but it goes no further. The same thing can't happen with Pulse.
But is that not the same? Sorry, now if I'm misunderstanding this, but if you invalidate a Pulse call, it may be still there, a record if somebody goes to check it, but there'll be no follow-up if it's invalidated.
Yeah, but in order to close an incident on Pulse, you're changing the status, which means that GISC Quality Review will review it, and then also every single Pulse incident is reviewed as part of the PAF process, at least weekly and usually twice a week by the supervisor. So the supervisors will see that the incident has been closed, and they have to agree to that. So it's not as if this can be done independently.
To get back to this report, that you're confident that your closure processes or your invalidation processes for Pulse are so robust that there are no lessons to be learned from this report.
The biggest issue from this perspective is the way that incidents are transferred from the initial response and then how they get onto Pulse. We have invested very heavily in Pulse data. That mechanism, that triple lock system that I described, that's been developed and implemented over the last few years. But the biggest issue from this report and from our own review, obviously, is the way in which incidents transfer to Pulse in the first place. Once they get to Pulse, yes, I'm confident that incidents are correctly handled. There is no such thing as invalidating a Pulse incident. You can only close a Pulse incident once you give a good reason for it, and then that disposition or that closure reason on Pulse is recorded, and that's something that we report on regularly, and it's something now that we're reporting on in our data quality metrics. It's a key part of what the CSO also looks at in their assessment of data quality, the number of incidents that are closed and the reasons for those closures.
Okay. And just going back to you, Commissioner, how can the public be assured now, following everything that's happened to date and the receipt of this final report, that incidents such as a caller reporting domestic abuse and that call being closed under info, and then that person having no follow-up, no Garda card dispatched, and it transpiring that the person was assaulted 4 hours later, how can the public be assured that there isn't going to be a repeat of incidents like that?
Well, I would point to all the mitigations that we've already put in place in terms of the controls in place around the closure of the CAD incidents, and also then therefore their transfer, as Andrea said, across into Pulse, and then the active supervision that there is, and very stringent supervision that there is of the Pulse system as well. And we're compelled to that active supervision in terms of just our data quality, but also making sure that we're following through with victims properly. I think there's probably a set of metrics, performance metrics, that we should be thinking about in terms of developing, in terms of just the quality, and also the quality of our work, which is done both in terms of receipt of calls, but also then that quality as it passes on in terms of just our data as well. So there's a lot that we have taken from this, and I don't like to characterize this as being a learning experience for us. It's been hugely informative for us in lots of areas, just beyond just the very hard system of CAD, but just culturally as well, but also then in terms of our relationship with victims and what good service looks like, and what the service that they need to receive from us as well is. So I think that going forward, we need to think just how in effect this can be represented so that it can be seen to be an area which is subject to examination, and the performance of the organisation as then can be subject to scrutiny.
And do you accept that this issue, its examination and the process of getting to a stage where we now have a very clear picture of what the problems are and what needs to be done in the future, do you accept that the role of independent oversight by both the authority and the expert, Mr. Penman, was crucial in bringing those issues to light and putting together a roadmap for how the issues might be addressed?
Oh yes. Nobody's doubt that whatsoever. And Mr. Penman brings his own experience from Scotland as well, and that was very useful to us in informing us around our work, and his expertise was indeed a great asset to the whole process as well. So we've been very accepting of the advice and his experience in this. And I think in terms of all this, use a cliche, we've been on a journey. I would say that the mitigations that we've put in place, and we're now some 2 years on from those initial mitigations, and what we've learned then in the intervening period has informed us well for the CAD2 process. We've very much identified this initial response in terms of call take and the management of calls is very much a specialism. As you've said yourselves, it sets out all the qualities that are required to work in this area, which is high pressure and which is difficult, and is in every day and any time that I've been in one of the certainly in the DMR control room, there's always some issue breaking, and so we recognise that as well in terms of an area we have to carefully monitor and supervise and support.
Very good. So again, you would maybe agree with Mr. Penman's report that the Garda Síochána should agree with the policing authority to an approach to ensure the quality of call taking, and I presume you'd be willing to work with us on that to provide a better service.
Yeah, well, I think that this is an important area around our performance, and then reporting on our performance to yourselves is obviously the oversight function then that you perform.
Very good. I've no further questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Shalom, and thanks, Commissioner and colleagues. Before leaving this, and before leaving that specific recommendation 15, which is the one to which Shalom has just referred, there's a difference between supervision and assurance. The authority has no ambition whatsoever to be part of a supervisory mechanism within the Garda Síochána. And that's not what Derek Penman suggests. What he was suggesting is that the approach to call handling be assurance, be underpinned by regular internal and external call listing and incident audits. And the way to do that between now and the coming into existence of the new body, which will incorporate the inspection function that's currently the province of the Garda Síochána Inspectorate, is that there is an understanding between the authority and the Garda Síochána. Not that the authority is embedded in the Garda Síochána supervising your every action, but that a key element of oversight and a key purpose of oversight, perhaps the principal purpose of there being independent external oversight, is that it be a source of assurance, one, to you as Commissioner, and secondly, to the public. And the report, in its crisp, brief, anonymised, detached, but very vivid reflection of those calls which were not well handled, and indeed those which were, puts flesh on the bones of this debate that has been going on now for 18, not debate, but engagement for 18 months. And the importance of assuring the public that the work that has been done is bearing fruit, and that that is provable by some mechanism of audit, is what recommendation 15, it seems to me at any rate, is seeking to. And that is no different from what we have been trying to do over the last while. And as you know as well or better than I do, this engagement would have been made far more effective, far easier, far less dramatic, far more open, had the initial scale and extent of it, since the precise nature was first identified back in September 2020, almost exactly two years ago, by Chief Superintendent Laura Mangan's engagement with it. That had we known then, the debate would have been of a much more, I think, would have been a much calmer, softer, more productive, probably much more quickly. And I think that that's what recommendation 15 is about. Not about the authorities displacing your managerial or supervisory role. It's about assurance to the public. Can I ask 2 or 3 very brief questions on this? As I said, the most striking element of this, in one sense, has been the quality of the calls experienced, the response to calls experienced by callers where the service was less than it should have been. And hearing a number of calls, as you did, as I did, and seeing the presentation of those calls by Mr. Penman indicates the acute significance of this work. You're right, Gardaí provide a service on a day-to-day basis, all the time, to people in difficult circumstances. But those who call 999 are in a state of particular emergency and particular distress and stress. And 2 aspects of that. I was struck by the number of occasions in which Derek Penman referred to requesting, recording and validating information, which is very basic, an absolutely fundamental element of this work, and it appeared not to have been properly undertaken. And the second is the issue of the quality of the engagement, the quality of the listening, and the quality of the empathy of the listening. We've mentioned this a number of times over the last 2 years, and I wonder whether the Garda Síochána has considered or has actually engaged in bringing people in from outside as part of the professional development of the core of people who are engaged in this work, who have experience of people who are who are encountering distress, who have experience of people who are afraid, who have some understanding of the psychology of fear, and who therefore make it easier for people who are call-taking to be empathetic, to understand the precise circumstances in which people who telephone 999 very often find themselves.
Yes, that did happen as part of the additional two-day training that was provided to the call handlers and call dispatchers. Independent individuals were brought in who experience from the NGOs, and also we used our own negotiators as well, who are exceptionally highly trained in dealing with people who are obviously in very stressed scenarios. So that was a part of the training that was undertaken and provided, and now is part of the initial training and refresher training for control room staff as well. So that's obviously very useful, and you're absolutely correct. The control room is dealing with very difficult matters all the time, but for each individual, this is a unique scenario, and so we want to be as sure as we can that every individual is treated properly, and that piece about making sure the information is obtained, effectively, efficiently with empathy, and making sure then it is properly conveyed on, so that to dispatch quickly as well. There is an urgency in this work, and often the urgency is sometimes driven by calls that are waiting to be answered as well. So it is a stressful environment, and people under stress, it's not just the callers coming in, but the people receiving the calls can be in a stressful scenario as well. They do have rest periods, there is active supervision, but again, it's not, we can't in effect manage out all the various pressures that there are in the control room. Like that, it is a pressurized environment there. And just to your earlier point, do accept that, and obviously, just as well, just for your own information, well, you probably know this anyway, the inspectorate is conducting one of its inspections at the moment around domestic abuse, and part of that is the entire victim experience, right from initial contact and ongoing contact to resolution. So that's an ongoing inspection that we have at this moment in time, with the inspector are engaged in that.
Thanks, Commissioner. I was aware of the Garda inspectorates. Just think that there is a need for the level of assurance that's required by the public in relation to this, because the one thing that we can absolutely agree on is the importance of this service to the public, and the utter need to ensure that nobody is discouraged in the slightest way, and recognise the efforts that, as we have consistently, that have been made and are being made by the Garda Síochána, and the extent, as is clearly identified by Derek Penman, the extent of the effort that was made in the review that was undertaken within the organisation, and properly said, initiated by the organisation. But I think that it perhaps needs to have a degree of intervention, episodic audit process that is more dynamic than simply awaiting the report of the inspectorate, important though that will be in itself. I think Paul has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just to go back to this issue, Commissioner, in Derek Penman's report, he obviously looked at a sample of calls, and he wasn't able to look at all of the calls, and he concluded that in relation to his sample, no actual harm was identified. But he also went on to say that it's not possible to determine whether serious harm occurred in incidents where callers or potential victims were not identified. In these cases, there is the potential that protection orders or TUSLA referrals were not put in place, crimes were not reported or investigated, and some offenders were not brought to justice. We've touched on this issue with you before in relation to the likely incidents of harm, etc., and we've received reassurances from you in relation to that. But I just wonder how credible those reassurances can be in cases where callers were not identified. Are you satisfied that the reassurances that you have previously provided in relation to this specific issue still stand?
Okay, I'll start with this one, Paul. Okay, so in October last year, at one of our meetings, I stated that no harm was caused by our lack of initial engagement. And at that point in time, we had 114 crime incidents that weren't recorded. So at this remove, we've 141 crime incidents that weren't recorded at the time. Of those 141 unrecorded crimes, 37 were incidents where harm was indicated during the initial call. We've also established that 105 of those callers were unsatisfied with the service, unhappy with the service that we provided. So of those 37 incidents where there was an indication of harm during the initial call, we have made contact with 32 of those. And we've engaged with them, and obviously the crime incidents have been recorded. So we deliberately adopted a very low threshold in terms of the crime or harm to the victim, in order, I suppose, to try and mitigate any opportunity for service, albeit at a later stage. But we did make every effort to try and give the callers the opportunity to make a statement, tell us what happened, and we did that in all of those 32 cases and were successful in contacting them. That isn't to say that and we acknowledge that when one makes a call to a 999 service and for whatever reason there isn't immediate follow-up, that there is a missed opportunity. So Mr. Penman is correct in saying, in some cases we will never know, but what we can say is that we have made every effort to determine and try and, I suppose, give the callers the opportunity to correct that situation, or for us to correct that situation for the callers.
Just very brief follow-up on that, just so that I'm clear in my own head. So are you telling us that in there were 37 cases where you were concerned that there was some harm being reported during the call?
Yes.
You've identified 32 of those individuals. You've gone back. You've had conversations with them.
Yes.
5 cases haven't been identified. That means then, does it?
No, we have identified the other 5 as well, and they are a combination of accidental and self-harm. We haven't been able to contact, or we haven't. In some cases, there wasn't victim engagement, and in those cases, we weren't able to contact all of them. But they are the categories. So accidental or self-harm were the categories there.
Okay. And of the 32, you've had conversations with the victims or the callers, but have you come to a view or a determination as to whether or not the cancellation or the closure of the call prematurely resulted in harm to those 32 individuals or to 32 individuals?
We have no evidence to suggest that the cancelling of the CAD incident caused harm or resulted in harm.
But did you ask yourselves that question?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why. So, as I've stated, we used a very low threshold in terms of that question, whether or not harm. So, if there was any indication, any hint of harm, we went and we investigated it, and we talked to the callers, talked to the victims, and so we have no evidence to suggest that that resulted in harm being caused.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Sorry, Deputy, could I just clarify one point as well, just for the record. I think it's important to state that in total there were 250 incidents identified of concern. So there's the 141 crimes, and then there's the 32 within that where there's an indication of harm, but that indication came from the original call. The issue is of the unsatisfied victims, the unsatisfied callers is a separate issue. So they're actually separate to the 141. So it's additional 2, but it's a separate issue. We identified those as concern because the victim or the caller had identified that they were unhappy with the service, but they were generally were not crimes. It was an issue that they weren't happy with the response they got at the time. But we still include those in that category of issues of concern. So it's 250 in total. 141 were crimes, 32 harm incidents, and then 105 satisfaction issues.
Yeah, I have a very brief question. Before I begin, I just want to note that on both sides of the table today, there are more women than men. I think that's the first time on both sides of the table. On both sides of the table. Commissioner, on every occasion that this matter has come before here, I have asked the same question, which is, were the calls cancelled because who made the calls? So I note from the report that the anonymised examples given were children, victims of domestic violence, incidents where people had language difficulties, which we can take perhaps that English was not their first language. I also note from media reports there was an example given of a lady from the travelling community and a disabled individual. And I was just wondering, did you have any view on that?
I mean, there's a number of things there in your question, I suppose, in terms of the sources of that information. So, I mean, we don't have a date answer to that. I mean, they're individual cases. You'd have to look at the cases individually. But no, we haven't done an overall analysis but I suppose the thing to state is that you're absolutely right that in the cancellations that have been identified, incorrect cancellations, the 2932 cases, that the majority of those were domestic abuse related calls. The others were health related, so mental health usually, and then the final category was missing persons. So all of the calls, all of those 2932 fall into those categories. In terms of more detailed numbers on how many were from certain kind of backgrounds or minorities, no, we don't have that. So
will you be doing that analysis? Will you be doing that analysis as part of the cultural learnings for the Gardaí?
Well, I think it's a wider issue, though. It's not just to do with the cancellations. That's actually it's a broader issue in terms of the call handling and making sure that all calls are handled professionally. I don't think that would be restricted just to those cancellations. But we do have very detailed breakdowns on the reasons, not necessarily excuses, but the reasons why those individual calls were cancelled. So, for example, in 36% of cases, so about 1,000 or so out of the 2932, it was because the caller called back. So we know that was a mistake, obviously, in the case of primarily GVSA calls. That shouldn't have happened because the caller calling back should not be a valid reason for cancellation. The second biggest grouping of them was where the guards were actually on the scene and requested the cancellation based on what they were seeing at the scene. Again, that's not valid. So it's those kind of things, I guess, that we're factoring into our supervision and our training to say that you don't cancel GVSA calls. Now you can't. You don't cancel calls because you're on scene and you can't find the victim. It still goes through to Pulse and it still has to require a follow-up even if you can't locate the victim. So that's the answer, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you to your colleagues for the engagement on this topic. No doubt it's not the last time we will deal with it, but I think that we have reached a really important point in the conversation with the finalisation of Derek Penman's report. And I emphasise again that both the interim report and the final report need to be read conjointly because they're parts of a unitary report. I appreciate the openness and frankness of the responses to the engagement today. And we will, as I say, continue to engage with and maintain a keen interest in this critically important topic. And again, reiterate the significance of 999 and the encouragement of everybody to recognise it as being a service that's available to them and that will deliver a response in whatever circumstances people feel the need to make that call. Can we move on to the next item on the agenda, which covers the topic of Sorry, this is a public meeting, and we're moving on, and it's under the law. It's under the law available only to members of the authority and the Commissioner and his colleagues. And I'm sorry. Thank you. And can I move on now to the topic of wellbeing and organisational culture, which we touched upon earlier in the private meeting, and Valerie is going to open
Okay,
this.
thank you, Chair. I think a lot of the reports we've discussed over the years have touched on the whole area of culture on Garda Síochána and the organisation. And we've previously reviewed the culture audit conducted in 2017, and now we have the results of the culture audit conducted 2022. So I just really wanted to ask you, Commissioner, some questions around that, around the audit and your reaction to it. But maybe first of all, could you briefly sort of tell us how would you characterise the culture you would like to see across the organisation? What words would exemplify that for you, and what would it look like both to members of the organisation and to the public looking in?
Well, I think we often talk about this within the organisation. I hope I've said this also in public, certainly to the authority, but one, we're obviously a policing service. We want to be and seem to be compliant with our requirements of the individual in terms of protecting and indeed vindicating human rights. We have our responsibilities around giving, in effect, extraordinary things to any citizens at all. So
Commissioner, can you just switch on your mic? Sorry, apologies.
To a very high standard in respect of that. So there is then the piece about standards of behaviour within the organisation, and then how they are demonstrated out to the wider world. But we also want to be victim focused, and that follows through in everything that we do. We want to make sure that we are providing a responsive victim focused service which is keeping up to date with the demands that are being placed upon policing. So a lot of what we're about is actually about the actual service of providing policing and those policing services, and actually protecting people to internationally recognised standards. And then within, we want a positive culture. We want a culture which is supportive of our workforce, and which in Garda Síochána is seen to be a positive place to be, both in terms of career and advancement within that career, but also then motivation and satisfaction in the workplace. We have, I think, a very committed workforce that the vast majority of them give of their all in terms of their duties and their responsibilities for Garda Síochána. So that's very positive in the first place. But beyond that then, I think then we have to recognise some of the issues that are thrown up by the Durham survey, and then how we respond to those as well.
So based on the findings of the survey, how would you describe the culture of your organisation at the moment? What were the strengths and weaknesses that came through on that you'd want to take action on?
Well, as I've said, our motivation for policing within the organisation is very high. And also I'm very pleased to note that there was a strong alignment between individuals' personal values and the code of ethics. It was good to see, but also then, there's other areas which that's clearly borne out. And by Christmas we'll have over 2,000 members of staff will have undergone the Policing and Human Rights course that University of Limerick are providing. We scored well around just the commitment to the organisation and pride in the organisation. Again, that's very positive, and indeed, personally I'm pleased to note that there's been some increase in trust in the senior leadership of Garda Síochána since 2017. But there are other areas which certainly are red flags. Wellbeing and tiredness within the organisation are issues for us. The ongoing sort of feeling of around organisational support, it's just sort of like, I think that's around practically some of the equipment we provide, but I think some of the frustration that would be demonstrated in respect of IT and access to things. And I think that probably things like the availability of body-worn cameras, for instance, much talked about, but still we await legislation and the introduction of that system. And so when you say something's going to be really positive and then people wait, in effect, years to see it arrival. I think that then starts to give feelings of low organisational support. I do think that at the Garda and Sergeant level, just issues around the bureaucracy and that there is, and how that sort of hinders their work, and just as well as we still, I think, ongoing issues around the fairness of procedures and fairness around procedures around advancement and promotion. So those are still areas that we want to work on.
So maybe to continue that, what are your plans to address those areas that were lower in scoring than the others? You mentioned the organisational support and how that is seen as a gap in resources, and I think that's understandable. There was also a positive actually response, a pretty positive response to organisational change, which does augur well to you bringing in new procedures. But specifically there you mentioned a dissatisfaction with procedure. Could you tell us a bit more about what that means to you and what you're going to do about it?
Dissatisfaction to selection procedures?
Was it particularly selection procedures?
Well, I think that's that's one of the areas which have been a sort of perennial issue for Garda Síochána, and I think that just echoes on down. So to sort of to change that narrative, then we want to and need to demonstrate more in terms of just the fairness of our processes and the understanding of how processes are designed, arrived at, and actually what they're assessing, and how you can therefore prepare for them as well. So a bit of more, I think, clarity and openness around just those internal processes, and that would apply also then to the promotion processes. The sergeants and inspectors processes has recently gone through a change, and that's been quite a radical change from what hitherto had been in place. So there's some uncertainty in respect of that. So all of these surveys are always a moment in time, you know. So not long after this, we introduced a new uniform, and that might have made some difference. But in the meantime, we had introduced plenty of vehicles to the organisation, so that was probably a positive difference. So you're always at a moment in time of these. But what I'd want to say about them is, because we're dealing with a provider whose experience of other policing services, and then what works, you know, so viable tactical options for us to apply, then we can see then take from a suite of actions and what they might do. And if I look to Sean, I'd like to maybe set out some of the further precise actions that we're going to undertake, guided by the University of Durham in their work as well.
Okay.
The next step on this is we're doing a series of focus groups, and I think that's really important to get to some of the questions we just had in terms of what does this mean. What it means to us may actually mean very different things operationally to people depending on where you are in the organization. So this is looking at things at a high level, and certainly this will inform our strategy, but the opportunity to meet with personnel across the organization and find out what some of the particular stressors that they're finding that we can work on, and that frontline approach, those who are operational sharing with us what their concerns are, that's one piece of it. The other piece is, as the Commissioner stated, we have an opportunity with this particular cultural audit to go to other organizations that have been able to make changes in key areas. So if there's another police service, for example, in the UK that has made radical improvement in a particular area, we can then listen to what our members are saying and then at the same time go and see what others have done. So that process is also in
I know
flight.
the comparison has been with England and Wales and Scotland. Have you looked at looking further than that? We tend to look at our immediate neighbours all the time, but are there other examples that we should be looking at?
So, in fact, I think they've done 38 different culture audits, so it's not just England and Wales, but you're right, that's primarily where they've been. In fact, at the end of August, the International Association of Chiefs of Police brought people from 9 different police agencies, which included 7 different countries, and that included New Zealand, my apology to my Australian friends, Canada, America, and a couple of different police services in Europe as well, as well as the Met. So we met here for a week on a workshop that looked at these issues to see what other police services are doing. Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Now, I know for practical reasons the 22 survey was narrower in scope than the 2017 survey, and that I think was largely for practical purposes, etc. But was there anything missed in terms of what you might be comparing to 2017? And I'm thinking, Commissioner, of your opening there where you talked about respect, human rights, behaviours, being victim focused. Did you pick up those elements of culture at all in this particular survey? Because it seems on first reading that it's very much internally focused on the organisation, which is not a bad thing. It's absolutely a good thing and good, very some positive results and results you can work on. But the wider perception of the culture of the Garda Síochána among the members of the public you serve, what's your view on how that perception is and how the internal reaction of the organisation, how it interprets any external perception and responds to it?
Well, I suppose I'd point to the piece around organisational pride and strong alignment with the code of ethics values, personal values. What they refer to as social motivation, but that's actually the public service motivation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I regard all those as being really positive in terms of the Garda Síochána. In terms of in Garda Síochána, and I take great heart from that. But there are obviously areas that we want to work from. But this particular iteration around our cultural audit, this is in effect, this gives us baseline, gives us a starting point, and then I think the strength of this is then ongoing engagement then as we go forward.
And can you, and might be one for Andrew, I don't know, in terms of taking these results and also taking your public attitude surveys, can you marry those together, and can you marry that in your own thinking and your own planning with, for example, the CAD 99 report as well? Because we've seen cultural and behavioural issues coming through in many reports, and very often it might be in a minority, it mightn't be systemic. But where can you identify the broader picture of systemic behavioural issues that just mightn't be seen internally in a report like this? It may be that people internally are incredibly happy with their pride in the organisation, but that's not matched with other stakeholders.
Yeah, I think we are always looking at how these data sets go together, because each one, and you're so right in terms of the methodology of this it's a very particular report in terms of what it's looking at. So we are always working on how these various pieces go together. In fact, I work very closely with the acting executive director of HR on the culture piece around human resources, but also with the other deputy commissioner with respect to how to operationalize that and how that is seen publicly. So, there are many different aspects to look at it, and it all comes together as a strategy. In fact, we're working on a broader report right now on the very issue that you're talking about, to look systemically at how things unfold. And I'll give you a very simple example with respect to CAD 999. And we understand the need for specialization in that space, that the way that the job description is, and we have updated it, fulfills a certain need, but it doesn't go far enough. So that actually requires reconsideration of the entire pipeline, as many of your questions spoke to today, Shalom. So that work is in process. That's not easy and it's not quick. That's something that you're going to see over an extended period of time, but we have to make sure that those pieces are in place so that they come to pass a year or two from now.
Do you think there's sufficient appreciation of the role that leaders within the organisation, and I would see sergeants as leaders, inspectors as leaders, I'm not just talking about the people across the room here, the role they play in creating and supporting an optimum culture, and through their own behaviours and role modelling, and in fact the quality and intrusiveness, to use the word Anne-Marie coined, in supervision?
Well, no, we're entirely committed to that. I speak to all of the newly promoted sergeants and inspectors, and I have done so for the last 4 years. We've sought an increase in our establishment of sergeants and inspectors because we recognise the importance of that first line supervision, and inspectors do what it says on the label. They inspect things and make sure standards are maintained, and I think through that teamwork to a standard, and teamwork which is then also supervised and made sure that it meets the organisational standard, that's where we get our quality of service from. So it is essential, and I always emphasise to sergeants and inspectors the importance of their role, because in effect they're the individuals who are providing the service that 2 a.m. on a Thursday morning when
Okay.
the rest of us aren't available.
Maybe one last question, because I know Paul wants to get in, but you've championed a number of initiatives. The new operating model is obviously a key one. The anti-corruption unit is another one. Do you see that the culture is enabling the success of those actions? And I suppose it's iterative. Are those actions and those initiatives you've taken, are they helping to support a positive culture?
Well, I think I like to impact upon behaviours, set a standard and set a behaviour then which can actually then be demonstrated. I think it's always to call out things which are entirely unacceptable, because if one doesn't say it, then it can convey that somehow that a blind eye will be turned, or they are, or indeed that they are acceptable. So it's always important to say what is unacceptable, and then to follow through to illustrate then that you're serious about that and you're serious about the standards that you've set. That has an impact on behaviours, and in turn that will have an impact in time on culture. But I think, genuinely think that behaviours are the place to start, and in the end the impact upon the culture. But also then, beyond that, then there's obviously the makeup of the organisation, and there's also then the things which we say are important beyond just the behaviours, but actually the type of service that we wish to provide. All of those then build up the expectation both within and outside of Garda Síochána as to what we should be. So I think there's a number of ways of coming at this, and one should use every lever that you have open to you. But what I think is very important is the changes that we made are lasting changes, as opposed to, in effect, novel flashes in the pan, which just then fade away again. That we make structural changes and policy changes, then will stand the test of time.
Okay. You did note a number of red flags, and I hear what you're saying about acting on those. The focus groups is the next stage of this process. When will that stage be completed, and might we be able to discuss this again? Roughly.
By Christmas would be the plan, roughly. There's a bit of analysis going on, first of all, in terms of Garda members versus Garda staff, male versus female, ranks, locations, to try and see where the focus groups are best placed. But it is the ultimate aim to have focus groups, and then a documented action plan with implementation for issues arising.
I think we're very keen to hear that too. But certainly this is a very good overview. It tells you lots of things that may not be surprising to you, but obviously it prompts actions. And I think it's also a very good document to be shared within the organisation, because you need everybody needs to be on board the culture agenda. No one person owns it, really. It's owned by everybody. So, okay. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair, and thanks, Valerie. I just have a couple of questions, sort of flowing from what Valerie just asked. One of the things you've talked about previously, Commissioner, and various of your colleagues as well, is about the importance of individual members having the courage and the space, I suppose, to speak out and speak up about incidents where other members' behaviour falls short of the law or of ethical behaviour. To what degree are you confident that the current culture within the organisation supports those members of staff to do that? You need to put your mic on.
Sorry, I think the report itself touches upon that in terms of individuals, and I think the expression used is ethical voice behaviour, and that we do score well in terms of ethical voice behaviour, and that's very positive for us, because it illustrates then that people are willing and prepared to talk to others around something which they are discontent with or unhappy with. And both our own anti-corruption unit and I believe as well GSOC would report that members of Garda Síochána are coming forward and reporting behaviours which they find unacceptable. So that's to the positive, and we want to make sure then that we continue to reinforce that positive behaviour, and that is about dealing then with behaviours that are unacceptable as well. So there has to be some consequence for those who step outside the accepted behaviours of the organisation. So in that then, obviously, our leadership and our feedback and our discipline process are our important processes as well.
And I think in your response, or one of the responses talked about putting in place enhanced mechanisms to facilitate Garda personnel to report wrongdoing in confidence. Can you describe a little bit about what those are and how they're going to work?
I'll ask John just to set out some of the ACU initiatives, please, there, John.
Well, there are a range of different methods in which any member can report any unethical behaviour or any concerns they have into the anti-corruption unit, either anonymously or by identifying themselves. And actually there has been an encouraging trend of people providing their details in full and the behaviour that they're concerned about in full. And those are all assessed for any appropriate follow-up action in a balanced way, because there is a possibility of malicious reports too. And it's important that everybody has confidence in the system when that's happening. And then there are also, and encouragingly, clearly going to a line manager or a supervisor, an immediate supervisor in the first instance, and there are an encouraging amount of those reports also.
Okay, thank you. Chair, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask one unrelated question, and then just to go back to some of the opening comments from the Chair in relation to recent events in Cherry Orchard, etc., and the antisocial behaviour that was seen. I mean, obviously, that came to the fore in terms of the public discourse because a number of people at the scene had mobile phones and were recording it, and that made its way to social media and to the media proper. But I'm just wondering, to what extent was that incident reflective of more widespread antisocial behaviour in Dublin and across the state? And what is the response that you have to that, both in relation to the individuals involved in that, but also in relation to communities that are suffering that antisocial behaviour? And what reassurance you can give them about the delivery of an effective police service?
Well, obviously, we take the public disorder and driving incidents that we saw in Cherry Orchard very seriously, but we are also very conscious of the scourge really of antisocial behaviour, both in communities but also on our city centres and town centres. If I could first just turn to Angie just to give the response in terms of Dublin, and then maybe Paula just the national work we're doing in respect of antisocial behaviour, please. Angie.
Thanks, Commissioner. So I suppose in relation to the incident that you refer to out in the west side of the city, I would like to acknowledge the significant support we have got from the local community in that area. So we obviously have a criminal investigation initiated, and that is progressing well. We are in the process of collecting significant evidence to identify people that were involved in that incident. That information and evidence would be assimilated and provided to the DPP for consideration of any appropriate charges that might arise. So more widely then, I suppose I'm very conscious we're in the lead up to Halloween, which is a really busy period in terms of potential for public disorder and for fear among communities. So in response to that, we have initiated Operation Tombola, which we do each year at this time. That involves particular policing plans in each of the divisions across the city, where we tackle antisocial behaviour. So we have additional patrols in areas that are problematic across the city, and we identify, we work with Dublin City Council identifying locations where bonfire material is being stashed, and that's all removed. And we have a number of other initiatives in place where we work with local communities in terms of, and Paula will speak more about this, but working with young people to try and break that cycle of influence, I suppose, from others, and supporting youths through different projects that we're involved in, particularly out around the Dearmore West. but all across the city, in an effort to make communities feel safer and be safer.
Thank you. Thank you for that, and thanks, Angie. So, in terms of the national approach, and you talked to antisocial behaviour, there are various ways that we tackle look at this, but very much from a partnership collaborative approach. We very much recognise that the impact of antisocial behaviour onto the quality of life of local communities, and really that's at the heart of what our community policing Gardaí do in terms of working with local communities in that partnership approach, and the training that we have delivered or given them the opportunity to undertake in terms of the ZARA problem-solving model about working together to solve problems. There are current frameworks that we work under as well, so it isn't just in Garda Síochána. There is a national ASB forum which is chaired by Minister Brown, which I sit on, and then there are subgroups working that emanate out of that in terms of dealing with local issues of antisocial behaviour. We launched the Rural Safety Action Plan just last week, and again, part of the Rural Safety Action Plan looks at antisocial behaviour. To enable communities then to tell us about where antisocial behaviour is happening, we are rolling out our See Something, Say Something initiative. That was a text alert system that started out in Tralee, where it's a text that local communities can text into us and tell us, we can report anything, but it is very much about reporting that lower non-crime issues, but issues that they wish us to look at. It currently operates in Tralee. We're going to roll it out now to Drogheda under the Drogheda implementation plan, and to Longford as part of the community safety plan for Longford. So we will be able to roll that out more extensively when CAD 2 comes in to play as well. But ahead of that, we're going to roll it out in those other two areas. And I suppose that just finally then to say about the model that we're moving into about community safety partnerships. And I think when you look at the three pilot areas of Longford, Waterford and Dublin, North Inner City, the Longford Community Safety Plan again was published just 2 weeks ago. And at the heart of it is that communities not just are safe, but feel safe within their communities. And at the heart of it is moving to a preventative model rather than a responsive model. So, you know, the community safety partnerships build on the really good work that the JPCs undertake. But I think as we move into that community safety role, and that, you know, community safety is not solely the role of Garda Síochána, but all the projects that are in place. And finally, as we do have our youth diversion projects, with 105 of those right across the country. So all those sort of projects coming together with that real communities and partners at the heart of it, along with ourselves, that's where we start to really see the difference. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Debbie has one final question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I just want to acknowledge the recent publication of the report on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. I mean, it's an excellent report and a really good baseline on which you work, and it also, I guess, demonstrates the value of that type of analysis and evidence-informed approach within the organisation. But I suppose poses a number of questions, one of which is, what are you have a lot of evidence, and whilst a lot of it will not be unfamiliar to many of us, it's still shocking. It's still shocking in terms of the violence perpetrated against women and children is one of the issues that emerged. And when we understand that what is recorded by yourselves is a fraction of what actually happens within our society. So I wondered what implications it has for you as an organisation in terms of your approaches. So you, over the past number of years, you have had a number of innovative approaches to dealing with domestic abuse and violence. But is there an opportunity to bring all of that into one place to inform the organisation and the public about not only what the issues are, which are very clearly set out, but what your response is, what your clear response is. Thank you.
Well, I think at some level, you're right. A lot of this was known, but what we've done is actually provide, you know, hard facts and evidence around that. Not only informs us as a police organisation, it also informs then policymakers, but it also then assists in terms of our engagement with the NGOs and those who support the victims both of serious sexual assault and domestic abuse. And this is very important information for them as well. I think one of the big pieces for us is around the issue of prevalence and then reporting on to Garda Síochána. So we have to look to other nations around their recording of prevalence to get, and that gives us some predictor of what prevalence might be here in Ireland and whether it's increasing or decreasing or whether it's staying on a plateau. And I think that's the second piece of this. If we can understand more about prevalence, then we can understand more about reporting and how we increase reporting as well. One of the objectives is that increased reporting and increased interventions and being successful then in those interventions, whether it's a criminal justice intervention that we lead on or some other intervention which brings a person who's at risk to a place of greater or safety or actual safety in itself. So those are important sort of longer term pieces around this. I think it does vindicate our investment both in terms of personnel and training and equipment, and I think that's also been borne out then by the increased monies that we receive next year for further investment both in our National Bureau and then in our District Protective Services Bureau. In terms of sort of bringing this to one place, then we would look to our partners, particularly then in the Department of Justice, and the work that they're doing in terms of just more understanding in the community of what the risks are and what practically is happening as we understand it in terms of the reports to us, and therefore then what our response should be. But we've learned a lot from this, and this is the beginning actually then of a cycle of further reports, and which will then give us, you know, a longitudinal examination of just what the problem is, and then probably, well, hopefully then, what tactics are successful, one in increasing reporting, and two are successful in terms of victim engagement and bringing victims to a safer place. So we want to keep on learning, we want to keep on looking for best practice elsewhere, and then seeing then how we can bring it and use it in an innovative way in Ireland here.
Thank you. I mean, that's very helpful and hopeful in terms of the plan forward. But I wonder about also the implications for recording and how you record. I mean, do you know, for example, how many of those victims are repeat victims? Do you know, for example, how many of those victims have protection orders? You know, those sorts of things. Are you examining, you know, other types of, you know, misogynistic type motivations for these? So I just wonder, in your considerations in the future, if those are not recorded at the moment, do you have plans to expand the recording?
Well, I think there's probably a number of routes into that. What we know about individuals is what was in Pulse. Sorry, Andrew's probably going to give a better answer than me. Sorry, Andrew, you carry on there.
So, yeah, Debbie, so I suppose the first point to make about that report is that that's an aggregate summary report of all of our findings, and it was very important, I think, to get that out in the public domain to give credibility to what yourselves have been saying, the NGOs, and of course Garda as well, about the nature and the extent of domestic abuse as reported on Garda Síochána. But the important thing to note, as you know, is that the engine behind this, things like the victim-offender relationship and the other mechanisms that were feeding this quality data that contributed then to this report, they're operational mechanisms primarily, and while they can be used to produce reports, they also generate then triggers. If we can be sure, which I think we are very sure now, that we have a very robust mechanism in place for identifying and recording domestic abuse, that means that those triggers are in place much earlier in the process than if something was missed or if it was picked up later on. So, for example, the risk evaluation tool is automatically triggered by once something is identified as a domestic abuse case, which means that the entire history of that victim needs to be looked at, not just updated, but looked at every time that there's an incident to identify the risk to the victim. But exactly what you just said there, Debbie, we do have those other sources of information, and our objective, as I think we've talked about before, is that we would be able to construct a process, and again, this through the risk evaluation tool, to identify an escalating pattern of behaviour. Because that's actually one of the things that the report says, is that you can spot that there are both repeat victims and there are both and repeat offenders, and they tend to fall into the same sort of patterns, and not in any way to blame the victims, but they tend to fall into the same types of relationship. The offenders definitely follow the same sort of pattern. So absolutely there are patterns there, and that's exactly what we'll be looking at to see how can we intervene early to avoid this escalating pattern of behaviour, because as Chief Superintendent Noonan and before him Chief Superintendent Daly from the Protective Services Bureau have said many times that unfortunately behind every murder, and there are now a very significant proportion of murders, even though the overall rate has declined, over half last year that were domestic abuse motivated, behind every one of those and other serious incidents is that pattern of events that builds up to that. And so our objective is to use this data, not the report itself, but to use the operational data behind that to identify early interventions. And we'll be reporting, I suppose, on how effective that is. But that's our goal.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Debbie, for that, and thank you, Commissioner and Andrew, for those, and colleagues for those interesting responses. I think that brings us to the end of today's public meeting. Before we go, Commissioner, you might convey our good wishes to Assistant Commissioner Pat Clavin, who comes at the end of his term of office and his policing career next week. He attended a fair percentage of the meetings that took place during his 2.5 years as Assistant Commissioner, and convey our good wishes to him, please. And thank you, and to all of your colleagues for the engagement today, and thanks to my own colleagues as well. Meeting is now over. Thanks.